Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by the Arizona Office of Tourism. This spring, follow your favorite baseball teams to Arizona for Cactus League spring training. Amazing weather and landscapes, exciting outdoor adventure, incredible food. Arizona is the perfect home base for baseball fans. Plan your spring training getaway at visitarizona.com/spring training. Yes, that's visitarizona.com/spring training. And now, here's our show.
The team's date of birth. A day to be forever remembered. February the 21st, 1969, Fort Myers, Florida, as the Royals took the field for the first time. After 18 months of careful planning and tireless effort, the big day finally arrived. Opening day, Municipal Stadium on April the 8th, and what a launching it was, as immediately the dream script began. The Royals win the opening day struggle against the eventual winners in the Western Division, the Minnesota Twins. They traveled through 12 innings. They won by a score of 4-3. This game becoming the first of 21 victories, the Royals achieved their final turn at bat. Yes, the Royals were for real. And the man who made it all possible tells us why. Royal owner Ewing Kaufman.
Basically, the reason that I got in the baseball business is that I thought the people of Kansas City and this great metropolitan area should have a Major League Baseball team. I also would say that I think that Kansas City and Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, Oklahoma are tremendous sports fans, and I thought it would be successful.
Welcome back to baseball, Kansas City. You've been missed. That new look is your team, and Mid-America's team. The young and exciting Kansas City Royals. A team that proved itself to be the best of Major League Baseball's new entries in 1969.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Greetings, everybody. How you doing? This is Tim Hanlon, and this is Good Seats Still Available. Yes, here we are once again, downloaded into your earbuds, and we appreciate your giving our little show a listen. Of course, it's Good Seats Still Available, and it's the show that kind of tackles the unimaginable. That is what used to be in professional sports. Thank you again for being part of the frivolity this week, and we're going into baseball once again with a little survey, shall we, around expansion, sort of a topic that we've danced around and nuanced just a little bit in a number of our conversations, certainly across all sports, but baseball in particular. Very, very interesting set of stories, and we're going to kind of survey the landscape with our guest this week, Fran Zimniuch, as we talk about a history, if you will, of baseball's expansion, kind of really-ish starting around 1961 or so, and kind of, sort of meandering through the decades afterwards. And you heard sort of one of them. 1969 was a very interesting expansion year for Major League Baseball, where there was not only those Kansas City Royals that joined the American League that year, but they also joined in the AL by another team known as the Seattle Pilots. Yes, a previous episode and obviously some future ones to come. The one-year wonder that was or were the Seattle Pilots, as well as two National League franchises that season, the Montreal Expos, as well as the San Diego Padres. And, for you longtime listeners, you'll know that the late 60s was quite the expansionary time for lots of things. It was the ABA launching and kind of pushing the NBA along. It was the great expansion, the late 60s of the NHL, which had been tightly wound with 6 franchises for the longest of times until this sort of explosion started in the 1967 and then beyond seasons. And Major League Baseball was no shrinking violet when it came to this too. They recognized that the greener pastures were to be had. And clearly, as we'll talk about with Fran, a whole sort of a series, if you will, of expansion moves 61, 62, you had the Mets and the Houston Colt 45s, and the sort of a response to the Continental League. We've talked about that with our old pal Russ Buchheit on a previous episode, that Continental League that sort of was threatened but never sort of came to be. But in 1969, those 4 teams joined. And, I just find it comical, that little clip that you heard there from, I don't know, it was like I guess it was a 1970 sort of recap of the initial 1969 season of the Kansas City Royals. Here's a really good example, right? So we like to focus on teams that and leagues, no longer with us. Obviously, the Royals are still very much with us. As a matter of fact, playing very much in the same stadium, pretty much, that they've been playing most of their adult lives in Kansas City since the early 70s, when they moved into Kauffman, or now what was Royals/Kauffman Stadium. And the notion that they were the best of the 4 expansion teams, but kind of barely, right? Let's be honest. I mean, the Kansas City Royals, in their first season, 69 wins, okay, but barely better than the Pilots that won 64 times, 64-98 to be exact. Yeah, it was a .395 winning percentage, and they had to move to Milwaukee the next season. But let's be honest, the Royals didn't sort of burn up the American League. And of course, the Expos and the San Diego Padres did quite poorly as well, both tying themselves, if you will, with a futile record of 52 wins and 110 losses. So, franchises that expand usually in their first few seasons don't do so well, but it's a relative statement. However, it is important to know, and again, Kansas City is a great case in point. You have to sort of understand some of the teams that preceded some of these expansion franchises. Kansas City, a really good example. You remember some of our previous conversations. The Kansas City A's, owned by a whack job owner by the name of Charlie Finley, a shrewd, crazy like a fox, perhaps, obviously had moved the Kansas City A's to Oakland 2 seasons prior, 1968. So 67 was the last year of the Kansas City A's. 68 was baseball less for Kansas City. And in come these new expansion franchise Kansas City Royals in 1969. So, this is a game of musical chairs. It's a game of expansionary times in pro sports generally, in baseball specifically. And the Royals just one of a number of teams and situations and expansionary moves that we get into this week with our guest Fran Zimniuch, as we talk about expansion over the years in what is now Major League Baseball, and a little bit of an arc, I guess, of history, and some topics that we've discussed in the past, put in context, as well as a few teams that we kind of really haven't even touched yet in our little journey together. And we look forward to sharing this little chat with you in just a moment's time. Let us get a sponsor note out of the way first. And we tip our baseball cap this week as we squint hard into the calendar, looking desperately for the beginnings of spring training. With our friends at 503 Sports, the king of throwbacks. Yes, indeed. Dustin Alameda, the chief proprietor of such, out there in beautiful Portland, Oregon. 503-sports.com. You've heard us talk about them before. You'll hear us talk about them more often than not in future episodes. And we love 503 Sports and all of their throwback goodness. And a great way to celebrate this episode, as perhaps you'd like to reminisce about some of your favorite expansion teams, some of whom are still around, some of whom have stumbled into obscurity. And at 503-sports.com, just click over to the baseball section, and you're going to find some really cool stuff. You'll find some lovingly crafted, handcrafted, and custom-made replica jerseys of some of the teams that we talk about in this week's episode. The 69 Seattle Pilots jersey, that's pretty smart looking. How about a Colts 45 jersey? That's really cool, too. You don't see many of those around. And there's just all kinds of great stuff. There's a Colt 45's a profile cap. You can get a couple of different kind of T-shirt looks for the Pilots. There's some old Washington Senators shirts and jerseys, both the first and second versions of the Senators. Really cool stuff, all there to be found and enjoyed and purchased, wink, wink, nod, nod, at 503-sports.com. And by the way, it's not just baseball. I mean, Dustin and friends have tons of great stuff across a whole wide range of sports and leagues, like football. I mean, the UFL, which we talked about with our pal Michael Hugh a number of episodes ago, the USFL and XFL, the old version, of course, not the new one, and other great stuff, WHA, WHL, minor league. The ABA is represented, lots of great stuff. Lots of not only great shirts, but awesome custom-made jerseys that are crafted from photography and with great accuracy from the past. Again, 503-sports.com. And, of course, we have a promo code for you. Please use the promo code SEATS and get and enjoy 10% off all of your purchases. Again, that's at 503-SPORTS. 503, the number is 503 dash, don't forget the dash sports. 503-sports.com, promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. We thank 503 Sports, we thank Dustin, and we thank you for giving them a try and giving us a listen further with our conversation coming up with Fran as we talk about expansion and baseball, and we hope you please enjoy. Why don't you give our audience a sense of who you are and why, you kind of focused yourself on sort of this pretty, surprising story of the relative inelegance of baseball's expansion over the last 100 years or so.
Inelegance is a really good word for it. I guess I should explain, Tim, the thing I like to write about in baseball, unfortunately, won't make me rich. I like to look at things that are now and look at the history of them. So, for instance, I wrote a book called Going, Going, Gone, which was a history of baseball trades. I wrote a book called Fireman, The Evolution of the Closer in Baseball, which was literally the history of relief pitching and how the game has changed from where it used to be incumbent on the starter to go 7 or 8 innings. Now, all of a sudden, the game starts with the 9th inning and works its way forward. Wrote another book called A History of Cheating in Sports. So it just seemed like the natural thing to write about was expansion, because it's such a big part of our life, and there are so many teams in the league now that it just was something that interested me. So I did some research and had some great stories.
Well, look, there's we've done a lot of sort of various explorations, plural, around not only baseball's sort of fitful history, and plenty more to come, by the way, the teams and expansions and relocations and all that kind of stuff, but also of other sports too. And there are obviously some larger themes that sort of come along with that. And maybe we'll touch on some of those as we get along in our chat here. But economics certainly is one. Demography is certainly another. There are things around antitrust and people's desire to be part of a small club, shall we say, of owners, and maybe being shut out of such. We'll probably touch on all of those, but maybe you can kind of sort of, walk our audience through some of the beginnings of this story in your book, Baseball's New Frontier, because I think a lot of it sort of circles around the inarguable, shot across the bow of these two beloved franchises in New York, one being in Brooklyn and one being in the Polo Grounds, moving their hearts, souls, and bodies and franchises, whole lock, stock, and barrel, to the West Coast in the late 1950s. But maybe there's a preface to that, too. Actually,
there is. And when they moved their teams out of that city, they took the heart out of a lot of the fans. And I've spoken to people who still will not call the Los Angeles Dodgers the LA Dodgers. They just have such a hatred for them for moving. But basically, if you want to talk about when the advent of baseball expansion started and why, it's funny, and again, I'll be hopping around a little bit, I guess, but the National Football League had teams on the West Coast in the 30s. Baseball lagged way behind. But just to give you an idea, some of the things that led to expansion, first off, was jet travel, believe it or not. An interesting little note, again, I have very little things to do with my life, so I like stuff like this. The first team to fly to another city was the Cincinnati Reds, who flew to Chicago on June 8th, 1934. And that opened up the floodgates. And again, jet travel became much more prevalent in the 1950s. In 1955, the average distance between major league ballparks was 469 miles. By 2005, the average distance between major league ballparks was 1,155. So you can tell that the landscape has changed. In the 1950s, people had more discretionary income. World War II was over. The Korean conflict, if you want to call it that, was ending. Times were good. Everybody liked Ike. In 1950, the average income in the United States was $3,210 a year. By 1959, it had risen to $5,010, 64% increase. So again, people are beginning to travel more. They have more discretionary income. Another major thing was we became a car-centric society. In 1950, 60% of American families owned a car. By 1959, it was 77%. So we see the whole idea of the American dream changing. Now the American dream became having a house in the suburbs and a driving commute to work. Big cities were losing population because of that. And as a result of this migration to the suburbs, 8 of the 10 largest cities in the United States neither maintained or increased population in the 1950s. The only cities that increased population were New York and Los Angeles. So you can see a trend here. People are moving out of the cities into the suburbs, and I think that showed that there were going to be opportunities for owners who wanted to move their teams, like you mentioned earlier, out of the cities. However, while all this is going on, something else was happening. As I mentioned, the National Football League was already on the West Coast. There wasn't a Major League Baseball league. However, the people who moved to the West Coast or who lived there weren't without baseball. They had the Pacific Coast League, which had been in existence since around 1902 or 1903. Their teams included some great names here.
Pretty high quality, too, the Pacific Coast League versus...
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Right?
And this is really interesting because MLB shut them out. Some of the teams in Pacific Coast League were the Hollywood Stars, the Los Angeles Angels, the Oakland Oaks, the Portland Beavers, the Sacramento Salons, the San Francisco Seals, the San Diego Padres, and the Seattle Reniers. A yearly occurrence, which I didn't know, saw the PCL commissioner, a gentleman with the poor name of Clarence Pants Rowland, go to every Major League Baseball commissioner about forming a third major league. The overtures were turned down because MLB preferred to do away with the Pacific Coast League because they viewed them as a geographic rival, and they realized that sometime in the future, Major League Baseball would be on the West Coast. Interestingly enough, the Pacific Coast League actually outdrew some big league clubs until the advent of television.
That's extremely interesting. But it's also not surprising, I guess, when you sort of maybe look back on it, that right. There's it becomes not only a rivalry but a pursuit of profits and territorial preservation, so to speak. And if anybody is going to sort of oversee, I guess, the expansion of baseball in the country, right? The owners of major league teams are probably the ones that are fancying on doing that versus, absorbing, shall we say, something that already exists on the West Coast.
Oh, you're accusing them of being heavy-handed? Oh my gosh, you're kidding. The trend continues, though, and here's another interesting thing that I found. And again, if you want to interrupt if I'm going on too long or something, just
no. This is great. This is great setup.
One of the themes that I discovered in the book is that while things in baseball and in society in the 50s may have appeared just fine, there was a strong undertow of trouble that continued to grow in society and in baseball. In society, the 1950s were a great time to be alive. Obviously, you and I were too young for that, but anyway, the post-war United States of America was a good place to be. But under the surface, there were a lot of issues such as racial discrimination that were just below the surface. And the same was true in baseball. Even though most teams were doing well, some franchises were suffering financially due to low attendance, particularly the Boston Braves, the St. Louis Browns, and the Philadelphia Athletics.
No, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Those three in particular, yes.
Yeah. And when the American League was founded in 1901, most teams were put into cities where there was already a National League franchise. So you're kind of swimming upstream. These three troubled teams moved to different cities in the 1950s, which caused a domino effect in many different areas. The Boston Braves left Boston to the more popular Red Sox in 1953 and became the Milwaukee Braves. A year later, because they couldn't compete with the Cardinals, the St. Louis Browns moved to Baltimore to become the Orioles. And in 1955, the Philadelphia A's left Philadelphia to the Phillies and became the Kansas City A's, which at the time was the westernmost city in Major League Baseball. So this showed that baseball was open to moving franchises in general and to the West in particular. Now, before we get into the Brooklyn Dodgers and whatnot, there's one really interesting thing I wanted to mention first, if that's okay.
Yeah, and this is actually very important because, and we've talked about the Braves situation, a little bit about the Kansas City A's situation, a little bit about the Browns situation going to Baltimore. Frankly, this is really almost overlooked kind of subtext to, I think the bigger shot across the bow, which people sort of ascribe to Brooklyn and to New York moving westward.
Right. We can get right back to New York and whatnot, but I found something that I thought was fascinating in my research for this book. I think it's safe to say, had the Japanese not bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, there would still probably be a team called the Brooklyn Dodgers, and the New York Mets would never have existed. Now, you're thinking, what are you talking about?
All right, you set the table. Let's eat. Go ahead.
There we go. You want an appetizer or go right in for the main meal?
I'm a meat and potatoes guy. Go right ahead.
All right, here's the meat. On December 8th, 1941, Major League Baseball was going to have its winter meetings. At that time, a guy named Donald Barnes, who was the owner of the St. Louis Browns, was going to petition to move his team to Los Angeles. All the owners were in agreement with that. And another team would probably go to the West with them and go to San Francisco. So while the Browns would be in Los Angeles, either the Braves or the A's would have moved out west with the Browns for the 1943 season. However, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, everything was off the table. But think about this. Had this occurred, when the Dodgers were ready to go to L.A., they would have nowhere to go because there was already a team out there. San Francisco would have also had a team. And the New York Giants never had any desire to go to the West Coast until Walter O'Malley reached out to them when he was going to Los Angeles. The Dodgers are going, or the Giants, to Minneapolis, Minnesota.
So and the fact that it would take a decade plus later to actually sort of make these sort of grander moves happen after the war and that such.
Right, but no one really realizes that the day before or the day after Pearl Harbor happened, Major League Baseball was going to have a franchise in Los Angeles and San Francisco. So like I said, when Walter O'Malley was going through his discussions with Los Angeles, there would have been no place for his team to go, so he probably would have remained in New York.
Well, okay, so let's forward it a few years then into the actual 50s, and you're talking about the lesser, shall we say, teams in Boston, or the number two team, shall we say, in Boston, St. Louis, and Philadelphia, all sort of pining for other locales and moving. That sounds to me like that's really the starter's pistol towards the bigger opportunities. But obviously most people, most average sports fans look at sort of the Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants moves completely westward as kind of more shocking, I guess. I think maybe people kind of understood maybe some of these things were in motion prior with those franchises earlier. But I think most people kind of, especially New Yorkers, right? You mentioned it before, sort of their hearts being torn out. But that's a real systemic shock to people and truly ushered in, I guess, if you will, a brave new world that many things were possible and arguably overdue in this country in terms of sports franchises.
Absolutely. And, it's funny. Everyone wants to demonize Walter O'Malley, who was the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, for taking the team to Los Angeles. But that was not his first plan. The West Coast was becoming a very popular area that was hungry for Major League Baseball. And, with these examples of franchise shifts, the game was moving to the West a little bit more. But when it came to Brooklyn, New York, Walter O'Malley wanted a new stadium to replace Ebbets Field, which was in basically general disarray. And more importantly, they only had 700 parking spots in what was a decaying area. O'Malley wanted to keep his team in Brooklyn, but obtaining a site would take several hundred acres, which was very difficult to find in New York. Now, O'Malley was even willing to accept the cost of building the stadium, but he needed to have the land given to him either as a gift of the city by power of eminent domain, or however they wanted to use the power to give that to him. There was a gentleman named Robert Moses, who was the head of the city's public parks department, who blocked O'Malley's effort to acquire a site at the Atlantic Railroad Terminal. Moses wanted them to move to Flushing Meadows in Queens, which of course later became the site of Citi Field and Shea Stadium. We'll get to that as well. While this is going on, while O'Malley is trying to get a new stadium in New York, the Giants were looking to move. The Polo Grounds had seen much better days, and their owner, Horace Stoneham, wanted to move the team. And basically, as I mentioned earlier, he had planned to move the team from Harlem to Minneapolis, where his team, the Minneapolis Millers, a AAA team, had a lot of success. So one of the saddest things for Dodger fans is they never were able to beat the Yankees in the World Series, but they finally did in 1955, and everything was great in Flatbush. But again, as I mentioned earlier, everything looks great, but beneath the surface, all hell was about to break loose. Los Angeles by now was in private talks with O'Malley to move the team there. But again, he wanted to stay in New York, but unhappy with Moses and the frustration about Ebbets Field, the Dodgers would actually play 7 games in Roosevelt Field in Jersey City, New Jersey in 1956 and 1957. This is kind of a warning shot. He shot over the bow of Major League Baseball. So eventually O'Malley just got tired of it, decided he couldn't stay in Brooklyn, reached out to the New York Giants owner Stoneham, who agreed to go to San Francisco if he went to L.A. So both teams announced and moved to the West Coast for the 1958 season. So New York goes from having 3 major league teams, the Yankees, the Dodgers, and the Giants, to only having the Yankees. And they were really aggravated. So here, to me, as a guy who is from Philadelphia, would think of a typical New York response. New York had a mayor at the time named Robert Wagner. He wasn't the actor who played Alexander Mundy, but this was a guy who was the mayor of New York for quite a few years, and he decided to have that rule, it's best to do unto others as they have done unto you. And in that idea, he formed what was called the Mayor's Baseball Committee. And there was a politically connected attorney by the name of William Shea, who headed the committee. And the whole purpose of this committee was to find an existing big league franchise that would abandon its fans and move to New York.
So okay. the initial, and we've nibbled on this on a number of different fronts, and we're going to get to maybe the big C in a second, right?
Yes.
The initial concept was to attract a team to move versus an expansion franchise, right?
That's a nice way of putting the initial idea was to steal a team from another city and bring it to New York.
Got it. So, but that it was not expansion, quote unquote, was not even sort of the first sort of thought process.
No, that was not. Now, again, that idea failed. But one of the teams, who William Shea, does that name ring a bell? Shea, like Shea Stadium? Anyway, he was having a discussion with the Pittsburgh Pirates, where he became acquainted with Branch Rickey, who was an executive with the Pirates and one of the great visionaries of the game. When they met, all of a sudden, Major League Baseball expansion was just a few years away because they came up with a fantastic new idea called the Continental League. Now, when you look at any kind of expansion, you usually see 2 teams coming into a league, regardless of the sport. There's an expansion draft, and these teams really stink for quite a few years. Ricky always felt that if you're going to expand, you should do it in 5 or 6 cities and have all those teams play against each other so that there would be a better brand of play. That's what the National Hockey League did when it originally expanded. I think in 1967 or 1968, you had the 6 original teams, like the Rangers and the Canadiens, the Maple Leafs, the Red Wings, and whatnot. They added 6 new teams who were in what was called the Western Division. They played against each other, and then they played in the playoffs against the existing 6 teams and were horrible. But they had a great first couple of seasons because they were playing against teams who were their equals. That was Ricky's idea about baseball, and of course that didn't happen. Now, Branch Rickey is an interesting guy. He's most famous for what? Of course, breaking baseball's color barrier by adding Jackie Robinson to the Brooklyn Dodgers. But he was also an innovator who helped develop a lot of other ideas, like the idea of spring training in Florida. He also was the person who began the use of batting helmets by hitters, and he also invented the whole idea of a farm system where minor league teams feature players who were owned by the major league clubs. Before that, minor league teams were independent and basically made their money through attendance and by selling their players to major league organizations. But to me, the most important and dynamic contribution that Ricky made to the game was his involvement with the upstart Continental League, which he and Shea developed after being unsuccessful in stealing another team for New York. Now, basically what happened is he and Shea formulated the idea of the new league and attracted owners who had something that previous prospective new leagues never had, and that was money. There were examples of other leagues in the history of the game. There was something basically called the Ball Players League. Then there was the Federal League. Then there was the Mexican League. And all these ideas were going to be new Major League Baseball leagues. And they all failed because there just was not enough money there to support them. That was not the case with the Continental League. They had people like Bob Howsam, Jack Kent Cook, and people like that who were well known in later years for owning teams. So basically, the combination of William Shea and Branch Rickey brought about an announcement that the Continental League, baseball's third major league, would debut on April 18th, 1961. The teams in the league would be in Houston, Dallas, Denver, Toronto, Miami, Minneapolis-St. Paul, Buffalo, and New York. So New York gets a team back. So this really caused a huge effect for Major League Baseball. As I mentioned earlier, while other attempts at a third major league had failed, this one scared MLB to the point where they agreed to expand because it included Branch Rickey and it included all these prospective owners who had money to spend. So as their way of basically jettisoning the Continental League, Major League Baseball agreed to put 2 teams in the American League in 1961 and 2 teams in the National League in 1962. 1961, the Los Angeles Angels came into being, and instead of giving a new city a team, they gave Washington, D.C. another team, which had just lost a team, the Washington Senators, who moved to Minneapolis to become the Twins. So because of a lot of political upheaval and threats and whatnot, instead of giving, as I said, a new team, a new deserving city a team, the new Washington Senators entered the American League in 1961, and in 62, the Houston Colt 45s and the Mets became National League teams.
All right, what's this? The Arizona Office of Tourism Spring Training. Oh my God. Hey, this spring, follow your favorite baseball teams to Arizona for Cactus League Spring Training. Amazing weather and landscapes, exciting outdoor adventure, incredible food. Arizona. It's the perfect home base for baseball fans. Follow your favorite baseball teams to Arizona for Cactus League Spring Training. 10 stadiums, 15 Major League Baseball teams, and 75-degree temperatures. Awesome. And all 10 stadiums are in the greater Phoenix area, all within 50 miles of the city. Meet players, get autographs before the games, and just enjoy an old-fashioned ballpark experience in beautiful preseason weather down in Arizona. Check out amazing restaurants and bars nearby, including tons of craft breweries like Four Peaks, Angel's Trumpet Ale House, and Goldwater Brewing Company. Enjoy live music from local and national artists, and explore museums featuring everything from native heritage to modern art to musical instruments from around the world and more. Arizona is known for its incredible landscapes too, as well as thrilling outdoor adventures. So hit the road and explore Arizona's urban centers or ghost towns or artsy communities or quirky outposts. You can hike, you can bike, you can take Jeep tours, hot air balloon rides, skydiving, jet skiing, or just taking in a good old-fashioned sunset. No matter what you love to do, Arizona has you covered. Check out must-see destinations from your bucket list like the Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, Horseshoe Bend, and even the great Old West city of Tucson. Bringing the kids along for spring training? Hey, Arizona's a fantastic destination for families too. Family-friendly resorts and hotels offer plenty of fun for kids of all ages, from water parks to horseback rides to games and activities. Arizona also has tons of stuff for kids to do and see, like wildlife parks and science museums, aquariums, and even dude ranches. So what are you waiting for? Plan now for your spring training getaway at visitarizona.com/spring training. That's visitarizona.com/spring training. Hey, and don't forget, send us a postcard. We've seen some of like this kind of response elsewhere too. For example, you mentioned the NHL earlier, right? Well, you know, there was the rumblings of, and there was obviously there was hockey teams in the on the West Coast as well for some time that were sort of operating in a minor league yet autonomous kind of fashion of relatively high quality, almost very similar to the baseball situation. And you know, and lo and behold, when the World Hockey Association gets up and running in the late 60s or early 70s, the rumblings at least, or, you know, in the late 60s, you know, that hastened NHL, not just with the 6 expansion teams in 67, but a nice drip, if you will, a solid, steady, year-by-year drip of more franchises in response. And I guess that's what it takes, is that sort of existential threat. But it also, I think, I guess the subtext of that, too, is there's always this sort of lurking antitrust exemption thing out there too, right? And baseball certainly didn't want to give that away in their lifetimes either.
Exactly, and that's part of the reason the Washington Senators became the new expansion team.
Because? Of
the antitrust threat that was always there. I mean, it was when Oliver Wendell Holmes makes a ruling in the Supreme Court, it's going to be kind of hard to turn over, but Major League Baseball didn't want to go through all the rigmarole they'd have to go through in court. So that's why they caved in as far as the Washington Senators in 1961 are concerned.
So, give us a sense then of maybe how, and we obviously jump around on the show, but how are the markets kind of being determined, right? You're obviously mentioning men with the dough, but in terms of, you know, to the extent that there was anything resembling a master plan, and you could make the argument that the Continental League was perhaps one of those sort of first, you know, maybe master plans or accelerated as such, right? So why those markets, aside from the very fact that there was an absence of top tier professional baseball in those cities, why those cities in particular, do you think, and or I don't know, how rational or well thought out would you say in the later years was, or the decision-making around which markets would ultimately get Major League Baseball franchises as the 60s and 70s, you know, sort of played out?
Boy, that's a tough puzzle of a question, I'll tell you. Early on in like 61 and 62, they had to take care of Washington, they had to take care of New York, and Los Angeles was natural because of the Dodgers being out there, and Houston was an up and growing city, which is why they got the Colt 45s. The next expansion wasn't until 1969, and that included Kansas City, Seattle, San Diego, and Montreal. Interesting story about Houston. Actually two stories about the Colt 45s. In their first couple of years, they played in an old, dilapidated stadium called Colt 45 Stadium. And one of the great ball players of all time was a Hall of Famer named Richie Ashburn. And Richie played most of his career with the Phillies, and he also played with the Cubs. And he played his last year, with the first year as a New York Met. But Colt 45 Stadium was around before the Astrodome. And in Houston, you absolutely have to have a dome stadium because it's hot, it's humid, and the bugs there are amazing. And Rich Ashburn once said that Houston is the only town where women wear insect repellent instead of perfume, which I thought it was just a great statement about the need for the Astrodome.
No, and that team was actually, it's fascinating, but also interesting to me too that there is a team that, let's think about it. It seems kind of quaint and almost naive by today's modern comparison, but the Mets having to play in the old Polo Grounds, which had frankly not fallen into dilapidation and had been basically tenantless for those couple of years, or maybe the New York Titans were there as well for a short period of time while their new stadium was being built. The 45s you're being charitable, I think, in describing what that was like. And I don't even know if the Astrodome was even in the mix or was promised as part of a rationale of getting Houston a franchise. You look at what the debacle in Seattle, where they didn't even really fully have a plan for a stadium, or it was mired in politics and whatnot. So I guess my sort of question is, today it's obviously, you need that commitment to be there before, frankly, you're going to even get a franchise. Major League Soccer being a really good example of that, right? No stadium, no team. But it seems really interesting how Major League Baseball would allow for expansion without maybe some of the T's crossed and the I's dotted when it came to suitable stadiums in some of these cases.
Well, keep in mind, this is early in the process, too. The Astrodome was in the mix when they moved to Houston, or when they gave the franchise to Houston. An interesting story about the Astrodome, if you don't mind me giving you another one. The Colt 45s had a relief pitcher named Jim Umbrate, who was a really good relief pitcher. He would have an ERA of around 2.4, 2.5, threw hard, had good stuff, was very effective on what was not a very good team. Unfortunately, he developed cancer. It was a really serious form of cancer, and he had to have a lot of surgeries, and there were examples of him pitching in games for the Colt 45s, and he had surgery on his leg, and they wrapped the leg, but the blood was seeping through. And it's just a horrible story. But his one goal was to live long enough to see the opening of the Astrodome, and unfortunately he didn't. He passed away during the off-season before it opened. But he actually has the world's biggest tombstone because his family took his ashes and spread his ashes into the Astrodome as it was being built. So that's kind of a neat story about a guy who just loved the game and was a very good player and left a little bit too early.
Well, give us a sense then, sort of. Let's look at it sort of from a longitudinal sort of perspective. How would you describe the process by which Major League Baseball looks at expansion, and maybe sort of through the side door of relocation around this time? Because it's pretty clear that the late 50s, and the salvo of all those teams, you had three teams in the mid 50s, and then obviously the exclamation point of the Dodgers and the Giants moving westward. That really, that sends a signal that westward ho is the mindset and the mantra. But I guess I'm really curious as to sort of the rhyme or reason, to the extent that there was such. Is it driven by economics? Is it driven by television? You mentioned air travel. I'm curious as to sort of the how and the where that Major League Baseball over time, or was it maybe sort of incremental and not sort of super long-term in thinking?
I think in many ways it was incremental, but I think there was always a basic logic there. And the original expansion, I think, was a a reaction to the Continental League. But after that, they're looking for areas that had population growth, obviously, so they could support a team, attractive places to go. You're looking for either a stadium that's already there or a stadium that's in the plans. And, of course, you need ownership that is committed to the idea. There's always an entrance fee to even join Major League Baseball. So you have to make sure that you have someone who can afford to do it and is in it for the long term. But yeah, you wouldn't just go to Des Moines, Iowa. You're going to go to a place that has population growth that could support a team.
So how would you characterize the 60s then? Because obviously you've got 4 teams kind of expanding in this period of 2 years. That's sort of the natural knee-jerk reaction to the Continental League that you're talking about. And but it wasn't until the ending part of the decade, which tumultuous at that, where Major League Baseball sort of ramped up even the beginnings of another sort of round and picking, frankly, some very interesting cities, but 4 of them all in one shot in 1969. Why Montreal, for example, and why, say, Seattle with its shaky and or not fully fleshed out stadium plan, would you say?
You mean Six Stadium? Yeah, SICKS. They actually didn't have enough seats for the opening game at Six Stadium for the Seattle Pilots, and they didn't have enough bathrooms either. So it was an interesting situation. I think to answer your question, Montreal was, now Toronto is looked at as basically the capital city of Canada, if you will. I know that Ottawa is, but when you're looking about business and finance, but back in those days, Montreal was the city. And I think the idea, the luster of international play was very important. And you know what? The Montreal Expos did quite well. It's just when ownership ran into some financial issues and had to sell off their best players that the franchise got in trouble. Seattle makes sense. You have the Kansas City Royals, Seattle, and then in the National League you have San Diego as well. So again, you're moving to Canada and also to the West more so.
So but each of these situations are pretty interesting and unique, right? The Pilots and Seattle, right, where minor league baseball had done quite well, and the Padres too, for that matter. But Seattle being the biggest sort of Western metropolitan area outside of the 2 or 3 franchises in California, some natural geography there, but. Montreal seems like an outlier, I guess, when you think about it. And Kansas City, right, was itself a response to a team that had itself been domiciled elsewhere, Philadelphia, and a guy named Charlie Finley moving to Oakland, right? It wasn't. Yes. It was an immediate replacement for the departure of the A's, but it's also curious too that the A's were never, truly. Warmly embraced by Kansas City for a number of different reasons, right? Some of them self-inflicted, and then the weird relationship with the New York Yankees, and then Charlie Finley supposedly being a white knight, and then literally getting on his horse and taking the team away. Yeah,
they were almost like the Yankees farm system. It was crazy,
right? It was crazy, but I guess my point is that these 4 franchises don't. I don't know, and I'm sure this is in hindsight, but. Against the tableau of the late 1960s, with all the other distractions going on in this country, I'm not sure that I would have necessarily picked those 4 places and situations as the next best places to put franchises, right? And Seattle.
But we both have the power to look back, and we weren't living it. They're going by the seat of their pants, trying to make the right kind of decisions, and at those times, they felt that the ownership and the cities they were moving to were the right places to go and the right situations for Major League Baseball. It's easy to look back on it now and say, well, this, that, or the other thing, but again, they didn't have that opportunity to look back in and I'm not sure the phrase I'm looking for. They just didn't have the opportunity to look back on something that was going to happen.
No, certainly. I guess I'm just struggling for what do you think the dynamics of some of those decisions were? How much do you think it was, say, the advent of pro football, right? You had a rival league in the AFL, pushing the NFL westward as well.
Well, the NFL was way ahead of baseball, as I mentioned. They had the Los Angeles Rams and the San Francisco. I don't think they were the 49ers. I think they were the Seals or something. But you're going way back. And again, you're right. With the expansion of hockey, you had the Los Angeles Kings. You had the Oakland Seals, I think they were too. Or they might have had a different team. But yeah, other leagues were going to the West Coast quicker and more often than baseball was. So I think some of it might be a knee-jerk reaction. But again, you're looking at teams, you're looking at populations, you're looking at growing populations, and then you're also looking at the economics of having an owner who's willing to come in there and make the commitment that you need.
How about television and media and sort of these I don't know, the nationalization, I guess, of television and we'll get into the 70s and 80s, the cable, but I got to think television and other revenue streams besides gate receipts started to creep into the logic too, as well as markets just, from a demographic perspective as being, attractive and sponsor-filled environments that were, largely minor league and maybe ripe for the picking.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when it's interesting with radio broadcasts and television of games, there were owners who were totally against that because they thought, my God, if we're going to let you broadcast games so that people can listen to them or watch them for free, why would they come out to the ballpark? But they didn't realize that America was going to fall in love with baseball, and that once you hear it on TV or hear it on the radio or see it on TV, you want to go out to a game and experience it live. So by giving people a free taste of it, I think it really opened up the floodgates. And obviously, radio and then later TV really had a big impact on the popularity of the game, and that, of course, led to popularities in cities that didn't have baseball.
I think it's interesting too because the way you lay out these franchise expansions in your book, there's almost sort of like a divining rod or a line between what we've kind of described thus far, sort of that first expansion and then the second wave, sort of getting through the 60s. And then as we get into the 70s, there's a line before that, though, which is around how players start to increasingly exhibit or exert more leverage and or say in the matters of the baseball business. And maybe a few words on that before we kind of roll into the 70s, because obviously the 70s generally was a tumultuous, and now with the announcement of Marvin Miller finally getting into the Baseball Hall of Fame, now fully recognized as sort of an important dynamic change for baseball, which was, largely I don't want to call it robber barons, but, ownership driven and led and not sort of an equal footing with the players, who certainly seemed to get a lot more, shall we say, foot in the door and leverage as the 70s came about.
Yeah, I guarantee you there's not a single baseball owner who is happy to see Marvin Miller get elected to the Hall of Fame, but, I mean, he certainly deserved to because of what he did for the game. What you're talking about, I guess, is the reserve clause, which had been in existence since 1890-something, I believe. And basically the idea of the reserve clause was if a major league team signed a player to a contract, if the player did not sign with the team again, whether they got a raise or not, they got their salary was decreased or whatever, they were the property of that major league team into basically forever. If you signed with the Chicago Cubs, you were always a Chicago Cub unless they released you, sold you to another team, or traded you. And basically the idea of the reserve clause was brought before the Supreme Court. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes basically said that the baseball gave exhibitions of baseball, which are purely state affairs. Owners produce baseball games as a source of profit and cannot change the character of the games. So it's still a sport and not a trade. And that way, that was the basic history of the antitrust legislation. Baseball's protected by it. And then a few years later, with Curt Flood, who, if Marvin Miller gets into the Hall of Fame for what he did, I think Curt Flood maybe should at some point too, because he was an outstanding center fielder with the St. Louis Cardinals. And then I guess I guess in the late 60s or early 70s, he was traded to the Philadelphia Phillies in a blockbuster trade, and he said he didn't want to go. And he basically gave up his career to stand up to this, and he wound up going in front of the Supreme Court and whatnot. And basically, I believe it was in 1975 on Christmas Eve or December 23rd or something, it was announced by an arbitrator, I think his name was George Vesey or Vice, that baseball's reserve clause was no more, and that there would be free agency in baseball. And at that point, the union and the owners sat down. They came up with what was a plan to implement free agency that made more sense than just having every single baseball player being a free agent. So you basically had you had Curt Flood doing what he did, and then there were two pitchers, Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally. McNally with the Orioles and Messersmith with the Dodgers played a season without signing their contract. And they said that this made them a free agent. Baseball said that they didn't. And this is where the arbitrator sided with the players. And that's when all hell broke loose in baseball. And players started to move a lot more from team to team and make a lot more money.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that also, in many respects, helped sort of fuel the desire to grow the pie and create bigger economics for the sport too, which I think would be a few logs of interest to further bring baseball to other lands, including, by the way, now you put this in relief around the 70s too. This is obviously when, a lot of the cable television infrastructure really started to get sort of laid out there and built, and obviously in the 80s really becoming a major thing. But the 70s really, I mean, I remember vividly as a kid, the two franchises in 77 with Toronto and Seattle, which was also around the same time where the NFL famously added Tampa Bay and Seattle. So, to me, that's a really interesting, because really that's kind of the first time that baseball expanded really after some of these player embellishments, shall we say, came into being. I'm just curious as to how in 77, why Seattle and why Toronto. I mean, Seattle to me in itself is interesting because there are a couple of things there. One is you've got both an NFL and Major League Baseball. So that's like high times for Seattle, with the Supersonics at the time. I mean, that's truly becoming a major league city in seemingly overnight. But it's also to rectify maybe the false start that the Pilots underwent in 69. The fact that the stadium had finally been built, albeit years later.
Yeah, you had the Kingdom in Seattle, which was a big reason to do that. And again, there was money behind it. Never ever forget how important that the money is. As if you have what you look at as a really strong ownership group, which they really was a little questionable with the Pilots. That's the one thing I think that has improved as far as baseball is talking about when they consider expanding to a specific area, is that they really do a lot of due diligence with the ownership group. And again, like you mentioned with the Pilots, you have the Seahawks and the Pilot and the importance of the Kingdom, which gave them a place to live, which was 1,000 times better than Sick's Stadium.
Well, let's maybe put sort of round third base on this, because there's obviously lots of different little idiosyncrasies to each of the teams. We haven't gotten really into the 90s and some of the franchises there, but we look at, maybe you can fast forward, and this is sort of how you kind of set up the table for your book, even a few years ago, and perhaps it's even worthy of a new epilogue, right? Because we see now a number of things that are existentially challenging pro sports, but baseball in particular, right? There's the length of the games, right? There's the bigger issue outside of just baseball, that of stadiums and politics and the finances of such, right? And you've got a wellspring of other leagues now that are rapidly expanding. Major League Soccer being an amazing example, right? Where, a team just got awarded, as we record this, to Charlotte for what was rumored to be $325 million, right? Where, and a new NHL franchise in Seattle, which is just south of $600 million. I mean, you wonder if there's peak, in all of this. But we also see now and maybe baseball exhibiting a bit more of this than some of the other sports, some real questioning of the long-lasting abilities of certain teams in baseball, whether it's the sport itself, whether it's demography, whether it's whatever, right? So Tampa Bay, for example, right? St. Petersburg is, we've all lamented, we've seen it on television, that stadium, and it's a sorry state of affairs there, frankly. And the idea of entertaining either a new stadium, if there's political will to make it happen and taxpayer interest, but also now, ironically and interestingly, possibly sharing that team with, wait for it, Montreal all over again. What do you think that signals? Is that maybe we're too many franchises out there now with baseball, and maybe there needs to be a little trimming, or are we looking maybe more at a new model where there is some of the sharing, or does contraction happen in our lifetimes, or relocation and or new franchises? I don't know if baseball's ready to expand further, right?
Yeah, I'm when we talk about franchises, Tampa Bay and Florida, I just don't know if Major League Baseball belongs in Florida. And I know a lot of people will disagree with me on that. But to me, that's where spring training is. You need a great facility. I just don't know. The Florida Marlins were really successful when they were winning. And then when Wayne Huizenga sold off his team, they became a last-place team again. And it's a shame because the fans supported them. As far as Tampa Bay and the Montreal idea, I personally love that idea because I think Montreal is a great baseball town, and it got a horrible reputation when the team was playing the games in Puerto Rico and before they moved to Washington. It's just because the ownership, which was eventually turned over to Major League Baseball, basically sold off their players. They put a horrible product on the field, and it's just really unfortunate. The Expos, when they were playing well at a horrible stadium, Olympic Stadium, supported them. That place they had fine attendance. The people supported the team. The team was fun. I can still hear the little theme song that they used to play when the Expos would come onto the field. I think Montreal and baseball are a natural. And if you look at the weather situations in Montreal and Tampa Bay, I think that might be pretty interesting to split the season because, quite frankly, I don't know if Tampa Bay is capable of supporting a team all year long. Where if they only had, like, say, 40, half the season, 40 games instead of 80 or something like that, maybe they would support the team better, and it would give another city, Montreal, another chance at baseball, which I think it richly deserves.
Are there other markets, though, besides, say, going back to Montreal? And I was literally just in Montreal last summer and agree that you will find a bevy of Expos memorabilia and jerseys and all that kind of stuff. It's almost like the team still is there and exists, right? And either in Montreal, you've either embraced Toronto as your quote unquote baseball team, or never will you, right? And that's actually, you're kind of chafing at maybe some of the rationale as to why Montreal might be indeed again a good baseball town. Are there any other
Montreal and in my mind, Montreal and Toronto, while they're much closer geographically, are much like New York and Los Angeles. They're enemies. There's just a natural,
for sure.
Yeah. So I think that and you've seen how well the Blue Jays have done. Yeah, they've drawn very well. They won titles and whatnot. Even though they cheated terribly when they beat the Phillies in 1993. I'm not going to worry too much about that. But, the franchise has been run incredibly well. And I think, again, if you get the right kind of ownership and the right kind of situation, I think Montreal would be a great idea.
Where else? Charlotte's always been thrown out there on a fairly regular basis. Las Vegas has been thrown out there on a somewhat regular basis. What do you think of other, expansion or relocation or otherwise, or to your point, maybe earlier, or my intimation, maybe their expansion and relocation shouldn't be, and maybe it's more of a do you winnow down things? I mean, Arizona's been an interesting situation over the years. Clearly, Miami and that stadium situation has been, a black eye in many respects for various reasons.
It's been horrible.
Yeah. What do you think?
You know what I think? I think a little. If a team or two were constricted, I could live with that. But what about an international team? How about a team either in, you could say maybe Mexico City or something, or maybe why not even Europe or possibly Japan? That would be interesting.
Well, no, I think not only be interesting, I think it's frankly logical, and I think you see Major League Baseball, trying to emulate soccer's World Cup a bit with the World Championships and trying to sort of make that into a thing. And we've had a couple of other conversations around some flirtations with that in many years past. I mean, Cuba, before it went under the communist spell of Fidel Castro, right, Havana was very much considered to be possibly a major league expansion environment back in the 50s.
Oh, it's a baseball hotbed. It still is.
Plus that, right? But yeah, and you look at sort of the NFL and its global intentions, and certainly the NBA, which is arguably probably leading the way in terms of American expansion to sports and stuff. Obviously, the NHL hockey is inherently more international, in its very nature, Canada and Russia and elsewhere. But baseball, right, is still somewhat quintessentially American, right? It's America's pastime. But yeah, the exportation, it makes actually maybe more logical sense than maybe trying to. But then let me ask you also this too: juxtapose.
You could have a true World Series. You could say maybe you could have a Japanese championship team, some other league, and meet with the American, the Major League Baseball champion, and have a true World Series.
Well, the only reason I sort of cast sort of a negative pall on some of this is because, and you've been reading about this last number of months, right, is the worst kept secret about Major League Baseball trying to either buy out and or contract or dramatically change its relationship with minor league baseball. And that to me sends a signal, I think, that, the charitable, I guess, relationship or lack thereof officially is maybe no longer financially tenable. And if that's going to happen on the minor league level, what does that say? Does that strengthen maybe that winnowing, if you will, the major league mom and dad, or is that maybe indicative of perhaps what comes to Major League Baseball if things don't change either? You're
seeing some troubling things happening to Major League Baseball when there doesn't seem to be a commitment by an organization to put a winning team out there. And you're seeing attendance suffer. You're seeing a lot of criticism and whatnot. And I think it keeps everyone on their toes. So yeah, I think that there's definitely something. There's something to your point. I think that Major League Baseball needs to be committed to putting a better product on the field all the time.
All right, last thing I've got for you here, and it's very interesting, obviously, and that this topic that we sort of focus on, I jokingly say that they're always making more, right? Because there's always the opportunity for teams to leave and dissipate, and we haven't experienced an economic downturn of any great significance that we're probably cyclically overdue for, politics aside, and that'll be interesting to see sort of, for the last decade or so, a lot of major league sports have, shall we say, taken advantage of low interest rates and expansion and television. But, television itself is being changed dramatically. And again, you wonder about
cable. Exactly.
Well, yeah. And streaming and people unbundling and cutting their cords and all that kind of stuff. It just to me feels, and baseball's probably, prime among them, that we may be approaching some level of interim peakness when it comes to how many teams and how much money and how much support for all these things can sort of go on. And expansion has been sort of, I guess, just assumed over the many decades for pro sports. And, it can go the other way too, right? And we certainly experience a lot of that in the conversations with this thing, especially challenger leagues and stuff. But, I don't know. You wonder how invincible Major League Baseball and all these others are in the face of maybe some of these challenges that we have maybe generationally not yet gone through yet.
Mm-hmm. I think it makes sense for baseball to constrict teams that are not doing well, that are hurting the product, they're hurting the rest of the teams, and put them in a place where they might be more successful, such as maybe Tampa Bay splitting a season in Montreal, where there is definitely going to be a lot of excitement about baseball. I think maybe moving franchises or constricting franchises at this point might make a little more sense than adding franchises. Because like you say, we might be at our level, and you don't want to go over that level. The cup might be full.
Yeah, before it runneth over, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, there it is. Thank you to Fran, and thank you for listening and perhaps considering a purchase of Fran's book, which is a great survey it's a great sort of entree if you're new to sort of this little genre of sports that we like to talk about. If you're really interested in sort of getting a decent lay of the land of the march of expansion in Major League Baseball over the decades, you could do worse than by getting the book by Fran that came out when did it come out? Well, the paperback came out in 2013. I know it came out a number of years earlier than that. Has a foreword by Branch Rickey III, the son of the great Branch Rickey, who was obviously instrumental in a lot of things like the Continental League and various doings in Major League Baseball, of course. The book is called Baseball's New Frontier, A History of Expansion, 1961 to 1998. It's available in paperback form. It's available in Kindle form. You can find a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. They'll be whisked away to Amazon and some other places for you to consider a purchase. It is published by our good friends at the University of Nebraska Press. And while you're at goodseatsstillavailable.com, you can check out all of our old episodes if you want to download or stream them or share them with your friends or whatever you want to do. By all means, you'll find all of our old episodes there. Of course, if you're not already subscribed on your favorite podcast app, by all means, subscribe to us there. Rate and review us wherever you can. Not sure Apple Podcasts is the easiest way to do that anymore, but wherever you can rate and review and give us 5 stars or whatever, we'd love to, benefit from such and hopefully get a few other folks to chime in and listen as well and be recommended our show who might similarly enjoy the proceedings like we try to do for you each and every week. While you're on the website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, of course, we'll have all kinds of things for you there, like our links to our social media feeds. At Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, we're at Good Seats Still Available. You will find us also on Facebook. On the website, you'll find a link to our weekly newsletter if you want to be a couple of days in advance knowing what we're going to be talking about and getting an early listen. That's a great way to do that, too. And I don't know what else. But, of course, we want to tip, once again, our baseball cap to our pal Jerry Payne down in metropolitan Atlanta, who, for whatever reasons, continues to put up with us each and every week and helps produce and edit our show. We can't do it without him, and we thank his kind self for doing it this week and each and every week, and we hugely appreciate it. We also appreciate you, our listeners. Keep those cards and letters coming. If you want to send us some email, the link, of course, is there for you on the website, but you can do so directly. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You got a suggestion, you got a comment, and yes, at some point we'll do some Patreon stuff. We'll do some giveaways. Hopefully, we're going to do a live event or two in the coming months, and we're going to do a lot more in-person types of things, too. So lots of great stuff around the corner, so keep tuned in. Keep your feeds clean and fresh and ready to go because we got plenty more content to come your way. We appreciate your listening. We look forward to seeing you soon, and until next week, take care, everybody, and we'll leave you now with one of the other teams that joined Major League Baseball in 1969. And what better way to do that than to celebrate the legacy that was, and if you're a Washington Nationals fan, maybe arguably still is, the Montreal Expos with, yes, the original team organist. His name is Fernand Lapierre. And here we go with the official, I guess they call it the Expos polka, but it was also sort of, known as Les Expos sont là. Regardless of what you call it, enjoy, and we'll see you next week. Take care.